For more on Namibia's electoral outcome, I'm joined by SABC International News Editor Sophie Mokoena. Good evening, Sophie. We actually said this ahead of the elections that one way or the other, Namibia was going to make history this year, be it in the change of a governing party or the first female president. It's the latter this time. They've elected their very first female president. Talk to us about this moment and what it means for the country.
Well, I think it's an important moment, particularly when you look at the results. You see that SWAPO got 51%, and it was this moment where one realized that the majority or the numbers were reduced because they lost 12 seats. But when you look at the presidential results, you see a situation where the candidate of SWAPO did well because she got 57%. In other words, she was popular, better popular than the party itself. And it is no surprise because people are complaining about how some SWAPO members and leaders conducted themselves. You'd recall that scandal, the fish rod scandal, where ministers were arrested and some officials are still in jail waiting for the processes of the law to take its course. But because she's a former foreign affairs minister, most of the time she was outside the country, but secondly, now she is the vice president of Namibia. It looks like not much was said about her in terms of corruption. Secondly, I've interacted with her many times when she was Foreign Affairs Minister, and she sounded like someone who was very committed to serving the continent in that international capacity and his country, and her country in particular. But I think the challenge now is she has to demonstrate that what she said to us outside the polling station, as you heard in that insert, she will be able to implement. She has realized that the issue of poverty and unemployment, particularly the young people, is a major problem. And therefore, it will be interesting to see whether she is going to really move with speed to address that issue. Because when you look at the margin, 51 is very dangerous. And therefore, the next election, SWAPO can lose power. And if she doesn't perform, or there are issues later, or missteps, or statements that can affect the party, SWAPO will lose elections. And therefore, I think she's fully aware that she's got a huge task ahead.
Well, certainly a lot is at stake. Sophie, these elections were not without controversy, from the technical glitches you reported on to the shortage of ballot papers. We understand now that opposition parties have rejected the electoral results. Just take us through this.
Well, you know that the reality is the Electoral Commission in that country, it looks like they were not ready for elections in terms of how they conducted themselves. On election day, there were challenges. And what was quite worrying was that they saw the challenges when they started with early voting, but it looks like they didn't tighten the loose ends or try to manage that situation. And therefore, you had a situation where the nation had to go to the polls for such a long time. I mean, a 1.4 million voters roll. The voting takes place for 5 days. That was just too much. And therefore, we are told that many of members of the Electoral Commission at the board level, at the executive level, including the staff in polling stations, were people with no experience. And with Namibia having a young population, when you look at officials at the polling stations, these were young people with no experience. And therefore, I think that's where the problem is, because it looks like there was a wholesale change of the Electoral Commission, the officials, the board and staff, because people wanted a new Electoral Commission because they didn't trust the previous officials. But that institutional memory was eroded, and therefore, it was chaos, and both parties, no one, of course, SWAPO has won and the candidate has won, but the reality is it has really affected the electoral process. And this is something that the country will have to grapple with particularly when they go back to Parliament as different public representatives.
Yeah. Now, Sophie, was it just merely poor planning or even the policy here where you have citizens having the ability to vote anywhere in the country also posing some sort of a challenge? Because when speaking to one reporter there in Namibia, she stated that of the 1.4 million, there would have been 1.4 million ballot papers. But the problem became when people could be allowed to vote anywhere in the country, so one wouldn't have known, insofar as the Electoral Commission is concerned, where exactly to place more ballot papers.
You are correct. There were more ballot papers. Ballot papers were available. To ferry the ballot papers where you had more people going to that particular polling station, particularly in the countryside, would have been problematic if they didn't plan, they didn't organize their choppers to take these ballot papers in areas where now you find more people going to those polling stations. And that takes experience and expertise and proper planning. You have to know that this is going to happen. Now, if you allow people to vote anywhere, the voter turnout will be good. It will be high because people will go and vote. But the reality is, are your polling stations and your officials ready to receive more people in relation to what the voters' role indicates in your polling station? And that's where the problem is. And when you look at the voter turnout, it was quite high, very, very high. So it was good for Namibians to go in their numbers, but you must have proper planning for such eventualities.
And then in closing, what has been the observer mission's view on everything that took place during these polls?
Well, observers did point out to the weaknesses, same issues that we spoke about, but the problem is how these observer missions are constituted is a problem. Majority, they are not independent people, and therefore they are scared to perhaps be very harsh on the Electoral Commission or the country itself. So you find this diplomatic way of communicating. And for this one, for me, what was even more concerning was that you didn't really have very high-profile people leading these missions. And therefore, I don't know what happened. Maybe the decision was that Namibia is always peaceful, so you can just send anyone to go and observe. And the interest was different.
Sophie, thank you very much for that update. That's SABC News International Editor Sophie Mokoena.